Hi there. My name is Ben Hulak. I'm a staff writer at CQ Roll Call here in Washington, D.C. I cover climate change, energy, environmental politics, and I'm often found wandering the Capitol looking for lawmakers, trying to pin them down and ask them tough questions. And joining me today in the studio are Tom Duesterberg of the Hudson Institute. He's a senior fellow there with a background in international economics, trade policy, and some tech issues. Also with me is Betsy Monso. Is that right? I'm sorry, Betsy?
Monsu.
Monsu, forgive me. She's
you.
the CEO of the American Coal Council, a nonprofit trade group also here in Washington, advocating for the coal industry and railroads to a certain extent.
The coal supply
the coal
chain.
supply
Ben.
chain. And also here is Dan Brissett. He is the executive director of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, and which is really a nonpartisan sort of educational outfit. And you guys seek to inform policy, legislation, general public knowledge.
That's right.
So the goal here for me is really to spark some sort of interesting conversation. Hopefully all of you watching online and listening find some juicy nuggets out of this conversation, and I'll do my best to dig them up. So I want to start with actually the president, and I want to get a sense from our folks here how he has changed. He's been in office now nearly 3 years. How has he changed? And I'm going to start with you, Dan. Actually, the conversation around climate change and climate politics broadly. We can dive in later, but the advent of Trump in Washington, what did that bring to the climate discussion?
Well, thanks, Ben, and nice to meet Tom and Betsy. I think from our perspective, what he's brought to the climate debate, unfortunately, is pretty negative. I think we were opposed to take some pretty impressive steps forward following up on the Paris Agreement, that the United States invested a lot of its political capital, a lot of its time and effort, and over the course of many decades, long before sort of I was involved, of course. And unfortunately, I think we've seen a step away from that leadership role. And I think that's probably where I would focus. I think if we agree that climate change is an issue and we have to find a solution to it, I think the best way for the United States to engage in that is to be the leader, to be out in front.
Do you think the president has at all brought out members of his own party to be more vocal about climate change, to distance themselves? Because, I mean, he has called it a hoax. He has called it a word I probably shouldn't say on this broadcast. To what extent has he helped others in the Republican Party sharpen their views, diversify their views?
I think he definitely has. Not sure that it's necessarily to distance themselves. I think it's a legitimate policy disagreement. He has also encouraged states and local governments to step up, which is important. But I think for international frameworks, while there is room for subnational governments in the Paris Agreement, it's something that the United States as a country ought to be leading on, and I think it complicates the future in terms of how we approach the issue going forward. One element in all of this that I think about a lot is that time only moves in one direction, and if we lose ground now, it's going to make it harder to catch that up, catch up in the future.
That's right, and of course the scientific reports rolling in from folks like UN, the UNFCCC, the Pentagon, even the answers, the report, the info in those reports doesn't get better. It typically gets more grim. Betsy or Tom, how has Trump changed the climate conversation in DC or even a different arena, nationally, internationally?
Well, I think that one of the things that needs to be recognized is that there have been continuing efforts at the agency level, such as EPA, with what they've done with respect to regulation for CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. So the prior administration put out the Clean Power Plan, which was really a transformational kind of rule that would have changed how we produce and transmit and distribute electricity. And it it would have gone from regulating at the electric generating unit to the entire electric grid or system. And it was projected to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, well, CO2 emissions by some 30%. The Trump administration came out with a new rule that was finalized this year called the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. It gets to that same 30-something% reduction in CO2. Yes. And it does so in a way that I think is superior in terms of the approach, because it relies on decades of precedent by EPA in how they regulated the power sector under the Clean Air Act. So it's back to the traditional form of regulation and likely more defensible. So these kinds of activities have been going on, and I think that should be recognized.
Tom, thoughts here?
I'm going to be a little bit more abstract about this,
Okay.
but all politics, it seems to me, is the art of trade-offs, both domestically and internationally. And Trump has changed the conversation in the following sense. The previous administration, and basically when there was a question of trade-offs between jobs and the climate, would, of course, support the climate. Trump got himself elected by pointing out that there were actual losers in these sorts of trade-offs, that being industrial workers, miners, everybody in the supply chain of the energy industry. So he is, and his policies, his tax policies, his regulatory policies have been to the end of recognizing that balance and favoring, to a certain extent, the side of the supply side, if you will, and those that the job creating elements of traditional energy. So internationally, he's also called out, if you will, the outliers of CO2 emitters. For instance,
What do you mean by that?
Well, China is the exemplar of this. China, as we all know, surpassed the United States in 2006 as a emitter of CO2. And they claim to be a big supporter of addressing the climate, but they have until, in terms of their entry into the Paris Agreement, as you know, until 2030 to stabilize their CO2 emissions. And so meanwhile, they go madly ahead. And there was an article I noticed yesterday in the Financial Times that they have in the process of construction or have already approved the construction of 149 gigawatts of new electric power generation from coal. And just for perspective, that is as much as Europe has, as much capacity as Europe has now. So Trump has simply pointed out that others have to make a contribution to the goal of limiting emissions and addressing in a serious way.
Right, and that's certainly a salient point. We should also point out that historically the U.S. has emitted 25% of all greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution. And I mean, to a certain extent, it should also be pointed out that there are certain high-emitting nations such as China or India that per capita emit a lot less, and that's a whole other conversation perhaps for a different day. But it sounds like, Tom, what you were saying is Trump views climate as well as myriad other issues through a transactional lens. This is about what other countries can do for him. Is that your sense? Or
I wouldn't quite put it in those terms. I think the operative term perhaps is a joint effort, reciprocity of some in some form or another. So, I mean, it's not just those that are catching up, like China and India, but Germany, for instance, views itself, and it is a leader in addressing climate issues, but in the transition phase, they're shutting down their nuclear plants. They're not shutting down their steel industry. They're shutting down the coal mining industry, but they're importing a lot more coal from us. And their electric power generation, even though they're introducing lots of renewable energy and should be commended for that, their CO2 emissions are stable. They're not meeting their commitments under the Paris Accord.
And is that stability due to what you're referencing is this program Germany famously embarked upon called Energiewende, which is
Wende.
Sorry?
Energiewende.
Energiewende, forgive me. Which began roughly, 10 years, 15 years ago? And okay. But anyway, to green the economy, and I want to bring in Dan and Betsy here. What is Trump has famously on numerous occasions trashed the Paris Accord reached in 2015. Said it's not for the American people. It's an international accord. U.S. doesn't have to sign on to it. Is this all just for show, do you think? Is this a way to rile up conservative Republican voters? I mean, what does he get for condemning the Paris Accord when really there was nothing? If he had stayed in the deal, which technically he has not left, but if he'd stayed in the deal, there's not a lot of laws. There's no enforcement mechanism really. So I mean, the motivation here is what to the two of you?
I think Tom articulated what is likely the motivation, actually. I think we can disagree about whether or not that's, sort of the right motivation to have, but I think the way he said it was accurate. What I'm thinking about is, you're right, it's an international agreement. And I think it's also built on the premise of countries moving together sort of at the same time, right? There is this sort of, I don't want to go first, but I also don't want to be last element in sort of people signing on, or a country signing on at roughly the same time and moving ahead. And I think if there are stops and starts in that process, it makes it more complicated in the future, but it also, I think, raises questions about, what leading countries like the United States, what we actually think about it, what we're committed to. And it encourages mixed signals, right? There will be a COP in 2 weeks or so.
In Spain?
In Spain. The United States will have a delegation there, but there will also be cities and states there as well, right? And, we're thinking we're talking about U.S. sourced emissions, right? And there are policy levers at all sorts of levels of government. And I think it would be easier to address climate change if the United States and the cities and local governments were all, sort of rowing in the same direction. Like you were saying, in terms of how we meet a nationally determined commitment, that's something that's up to us. And I think we're pretty early on in the process. I know that there are disagreements about sort of the merits of the Clean Power Plan, for sure. And we can continue talking a little bit more about that if you'd like. But we're at the beginning of this, and we have control over our policy. And I think we should all strive to do our best to make sure that we are minimizing the people. In fact, I'm not even sure there has to be a loser from this transition. I think if we give ourselves enough time and we make the investments, wisely and sequenced properly, I think we could all benefit from it. But it's hard to do that because this is a years-long, at least, maybe decades-long effort. That's complicated stuff. We're talking about an economic transition here.
Right. That's an ideal segue, and I want to turn to you, Betsy, now about the future of the coal industry in America, and what you think coal will look like, both thermal coal and met coal, or metallurgical coal, which is used in steel making, what it will look like in the States in 10, 15, 20 years. And while I leave you with that, I would just like to remind our folks listening and watching, wherever you might be doing so, if you want to send in questions, please do so. I'm told by our tech whizzes that there's a chat box through which to do that. But Betsy, what does coal look like in America down the road, 10, 20 years?
Well, we've been mostly talking about climate policy here so far, but I think that this forum is about energy policy. So let's kind of
Sure.
go back to that, right?
Yeah.
Because coal's future, it depends on energy policy, it depends on regulation, and it depends on the marketplace. So, starting with policy, it needs to be an all of the above energy policy, including coal. The U.S. has more coal reserves than any other country in the world. We have 24% of the global reserves right here. And those are very important to our country from an energy security standpoint, from an economic security standpoint, and I would say national security as well. So in addition to just the richness of that resource, we have the importance of the coal power plant fleet within the electricity generation portfolio in this country. And, our coal power plants directly support the reliability and resilience of the power grid. They are able to be dispatched anytime, 24/7, 365. They have fuel on site, so they are ready to go to meet electricity needs anytime, day or night, any season, and other resources don't necessarily have those particular attributes.
You're talking about renewables in particular, the intermittency.
The intermittency of renewables and natural gas, which is a just-in-time fuel. So think about some recent extreme weather events. There was a polar vortex in the upper Midwest in the early part of this year. And because there were issues with natural gas systems and because wind generation went down unexpectedly, largely due to automatic shutoffs of the turbines. When it gets to a certain temperature, they shut off. So coal was available to fill in the gaps there, but even with all of that, there were calls for consumers to change their thermostats. There were calls for automakers to scale back. So that's an example of why a diverse energy and electricity portfolio is so important.
Sure.
You had the bomb cyclone out here in the entire eastern U.S. in January of the year before, same kind of scenario.
The industry, though, undeniably is facing tough times. I was just in the Senate chamber this morning, and Senator Capito of West Virginia was talking about the pension benefits owed to miners. And that's obviously increasing as companies declare bankruptcy. In the past few years, Peabody, some of the biggest coal mining firms in America, have filed for bankruptcy protection. Peabody, Arch Coal, based in St. Louis, I believe, Alpha Natural Resources, and then Murray Energy very recently filed for Chapter 11 protection. So how do you stem that tide, and where domestically do you see brighter days ahead for you?
Stem the tide with policies that support all of the above. So, for example, in the electricity marketplace, there are, again, going back to these attributes of coal that are very important, inventory on the ground. So coal has that contribution to the electricity marketplace, but it's not getting compensated for the reliability that it provides. So changes in the electricity marketplace structures can be helpful to that.
It sounds like you're saying you'd like coal to be treated differently.
No, not at all. I want coal to be treated fairly and equitably. So there are other resources, such as wind, which receives a production tax credit. So they will run to obtain that credit, meaning they can go, they can be put into the marketplace at zero cost, or even below zero, because they will be able to collect that tax credit. and still make money.
Well, as I understand, it's not an entire, and maybe Dan help me out here. The incentives for wind are not. It's not a total write-off for wind energy from the government. It's not. I mean, it's not 100% sort of grant aspect.
It's an incentive that allows them to be
No, it isn't.
dispatched
Yes.
into the marketplace
not
in certain ways.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I
Sure.
mean, they're also being, at least currently, they're planned to be phased out over time as well.
Right.
We had a briefing last Friday focused on the renewable energy mix in U.S. generation, and there were some slides that one of our panelists presented showing sort of the cost competitiveness. And the renewable technologies are getting are cost competitive. Betsy outlined a number of benefits that go beyond cost. And I think as we look at how we're going to sustain our 21st century industrial society that is completely dependent on energy,
Mm-hmm.
at least in the near term, we have to think very wisely about how we balance sort of the needs of the system, how we match supply and demand every minute of every day,
Right.
and then also how we position ourselves to take the steps we need to take on climate and energy policy to meet the goals that we need to meet.
So let's talk about transition. And Dan, before we started, you were alluding to the fact that you had some really interesting ideas about how to bring about work programs and sort of economic development programs in regions of the U.S. that have really been hit hard by sort of collapsing industrial cores, including places that have suffered due to coal's decline. Talk to us about that. What do you have in mind?
Well, I think it may fall into two different conversations. One is there are some bills on Capitol Hill that are bipartisan that would encourage investments in the energy workforce, not just the clean energy workforce, but the energy workforce. But I think what is relevant to this transition idea is a recognition that the communities that surround these areas where fossil fuel development and extraction, they're the economy in those local areas. And if they were to go away, those people are going to be very, very negatively impacted. And it's probably not so fair to tell people where they've lived for generations, where these industries are part of their lives, that all of a sudden they have to, get up and move. And it's also probably not realistic to expect that they're all going to be employed in, renewable energy technology or energy efficiency. And so I think we need to think very carefully about how these communities are brought along. We will stand a better chance of success if we maximize the opportunity for everyone to prosper, right? For everyone to benefit. We're not going to be able to meet our goals if we're leaving people behind. Whether that's a mining community, whether that's people on the coast whose land simply won't be there in 20 to 30 years because of sea level rise, and part of that is there's a retraining element, but part of it also is making sure that when we're talking about these things, we're doing it in a way that involves these communities, that it's not something that's being imposed,
Right.
that the transition is organic in the sense that it's being driven and it's being responsive to the needs of the communities, because I think that will improve the odds of success in the long run.
And there's this sort of floating notion out there that coal miners can be retrained as computer programmers, and it's, I mean, that might work for some, but it's not going to work for everybody.
That's right. I mean, there are lots of different. Yes, that's probably the case,
Yeah.
and I don't think it's realistic to think that it's just going to be a one size fits all. All of these communities, we probably unfairly lump them into this big,
Right.
Communities label, but they're all different, right? Communities that are in, areas where coal is mined, they're different from areas where maybe there are natural gas reserves
And
or there are other
right.
petroleum reserves
And of course,
along the coast. Or
There
something.
are dozens,
Absolutely.
hundreds of jobs that are connected to
Absolutely.
those coal mining or extraction jobs that
Yep.
that obviously have knock-on effects with friends and family and neighborhood. And,
Absolutely.
I want to talk really about, I guess, bipartisan room on the Hill. What are the three of you? I'll just throw this out there. What could happen on a bipartisan basis, both chambers, on energy before this Congress expires? Is there something on energy efficiency, tax credits? Tom?
I defer to the two experts who are with us today. I don't follow this on a day-to-day basis. My impression
Well, that's
is
probably healthy for you, but
my impression
well,
is
and yes.
that not a lot is going to get done here in the next year or so. If I were if I were God and could suggest some reasonable policies to follow, I would put it in sort of a longer term scenario, because I don't think we're going to make this transition very quickly.
Mhm.
I mean, all of us, I think,
This
would
transition meaning,
to a less carbon dependent
okay,
economy. I mean, I was trying to look up some numbers earlier today about projections, and even by 2040 or 2050, according to the IEA and the EIA, we're still going to be producing and depending on as much coal as we do now. And it's partly because of growth in places like
Right.
China and India. But
and
the
just
economics,
quickly interject, sorry, the IEA is an international energy agency based in Paris that forecasts all sorts of energy statistics and runs the numbers, and the EIA is the energy department sort of in-house think
Yeah.
tank.
right.
I'm sorry, continue.
Well, and the reason for that is the economics of renewables are not quite there yet. We don't have good battery storage
Uh-huh.
technology, which is a big impediment for both solar and wind energy. The pricing of solar is coming down. It's getting close, but it's still not comparable to what you can get from natural gas or coal-generated electricity.
Right.
So progress is being made, but maybe we could accelerate that process by a little bit more robust investment, not only in the workforce,
Mm-hmm.
which I agree totally with Dan's remarks on that, but in technology.
Uh-huh.
We have, over the course of the last 40 years, diverted a lot of our national funding for research and development from the physical sciences and engineering to healthcare. And
Mhm.
of course, that's very important. But in order for us to meet our goals of reducing carbon, methane, VOC, volatile organic chemicals, we need better technology, and we need to bring those price points down. And I think we ought to think about more robust national research budgets to accelerate that process.
At national labs or at universities, research institutions.
Yeah, the National Academy of National Science Foundation,
Uh-huh.
for instance. I'd like to see a more robust investment in the hard physical sciences and mathematics.
I think that's what, having covered Energy Secretary Rick Perry, he often says, being energy secretary is the coolest job he's ever had, and he seems to genuinely beam when he's ever visiting some national lab.
He calls them his crown jewels.
That's right, Argonne or Livermore, like that. Betsy, jump in here if you would. How do we do what Tom's talking about? How do we cut emissions and do right by workers, do right by the environment?
Well, first, I'd like to say that DOE is doing some great work in R&D, and that should be supported in fossil technologies and other technologies. But certainly, I think there's opportunity for bipartisan agreement on some of these technology and innovation kinds of mechanisms. And there's been activity in the Senate this year. There was a bill passed called the Use It Bill, utilizing significant emissions with innovative technologies. And that was introduced by Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island last spring.
Who are, if I could quickly, are probably on diametrically opposed positions on
Right.
climate change, on energy. And actually, I was, again, to tell a quick story about wandering the Senate halls, there was a vote recently, and White House came up to Barrasso and gave him a hug and said to the clerk, "I'm voting the opposite of this guy," and they had a good laugh. But they have developed some sort of chemistry on
And it worked.
trapping carbon.
They had I mean, they had obviously enough support
Right.
to pass this bill in the Senate, which is pretty significant.
Right.
So it was a bill about carbon capture technology and storage, and ways to use carbon in new products and develop other innovative uses. If we're going to reduce carbon, how do we use it beneficially? There are ways to use it in advanced manufacturing, to make resins for 3D printers. There are lots of opportunities there. And so I think more of this is better, and really improving the permitting process and other impediments to CCUS is a critical step, because the projects that are in place, there's one up in Canada, there's one, Energy has one near Houston, Texas. Those were first of a kind projects. They were expensive. They're working.
And these are,
And so-
spell that out for us if you would. These are
They capture the
facilities that are
carbon.
capturing, these are coal plants? Or,
Yes.
okay,
They're existing coal plants that put carbon capture technology on. In both cases, the stored carbon is piped to be used for EOR, so for enhancing the production from mature oil fields. And that's just
Right.
one application. So it's kind of like building on that. And that's another place that DOE has really been focusing on, is how do we bring down that cost? Because if you look at this again in a broader perspective, it's not just about what's going on in the US, it's about global CO2.
Mhm.
And we're reducing CO2 emissions in the US, and coal plants in the US are not the first or even the second source of CO2 emissions. So, how do we think about this from a policy standpoint, to support what's good for us and what's good for others? And developing these kind of technologies also gives us the opportunity to export them. So there are multiple benefits. And again, that's why I think
Right.
there's opportunity for bipartisan agreement.
I think preliminarily the emissions are now rising. As of 2018, there's some early reports out, and those that may be revised, but emissions are upticking now.
It was weather. It was weather driven
You
in 2018.
Okay. All right. What about energy efficiency, Dan?
There's so
Is
much to
that,
say.
we have this infamous and never became law quite yet, always introduced every Congress bill from Senator Portman of Ohio and Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire. And this is, if you could walk us through what exactly that does, and sort of low-hanging fruit on the energy efficiency front.
Sure, of course. You talked about Senator Barrasso and Senator Whitehouse having chemistry. Well, you can eat their hearts out.
Let me
because
tell
Senator
you.
Portman and Senator
There's a
Shaheen.
sitcom here.
And then on the House side, there's an identical bill. Representatives Welch and McKinley
Okay.
have sponsored for the last few years too. Energy conservation, Energy Savings and Industrial Competitiveness Act. The bill has been around for a number of Congresses, a number of years. I think it gets unfairly labeled as this bill that keeps coming back.
Yeah,
That's
no,
the narrative. But there are lots of bills that get introduced
That's
every
right,
Congress,
yeah.
and the process takes time. The best sausage takes the longest to cure.
Indeed.
The bill has three parts, very briefly. The first is it would update the way model building energy codes are developed and adopted and enforced. These are codes that are adopted, they're developed as a model, and then states and local governments adopt them and have the opportunity to amend them as they want. And these codes are becoming increasingly important to sort of our U.S. Subnational climate goals. Over the summer, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, for instance, identified in a unanimously passed resolution that building energy codes are sort of one of the key pathways to net zero buildings, for instance, by 2050, and a huge source of emissions reductions. The second is it would boost industrial and manufacturing energy efficiency. Industrial assessment centers that are located at universities around the country, for instance. And I'm not an industrial energy efficiency expert, but these are incredibly energy intensive lines of work that you can be in, and then also manufacturing. Manufacturing, the people who run their manufacturing lines understand very well where their opportunities for efficiency are. But these would help train workers, for instance, and help get people sort of in these jobs. And they're good stuff. And then the third is the energy efficiency of federal buildings. And federal buildings, I could go on and on about. Federal government is the largest energy consumer, largest bill payer in the United States. Facilities all over the place. And for the last couple of years, they haven't really had an imperative to improve their energy efficiency, or in other words, reduce their energy intensity.
Why is that? Is there a regulation that has come off? Is there some policy
Yeah, there was
shift?
a change in executive orders
Okay.
a few years ago, I think 2 years ago. There was an executive order in place that would require sort of regular annual energy intensity reductions across the federal government, and that was
That
repealed
President Trump rescinded.
yes, and replaced with something that allows agencies to sort of set their own rules a little bit more, and it's resulted in a downturn in federal energy efficiency.
Interesting.
A lot of these projects are done without federal appropriations. They're done using performance contracting and other third-party financing mechanisms. And Portman Shaheen would reestablish
Yep.
goals and all of that. But there are others as well too, right? There are bipartisan legislation. Did you want to?
No,
okay.
I was merely going to say that this all sounds very wonderful, and I often ask why this hasn't happened. It seems like common sense, right? When we talk about energy efficiency, we're talking about like a better envelope for a building, insulation, overhauling HVAC systems. I mean, these are these are quite doable things.
They should be. I mean, back to federal buildings for a moment, Senators Murkowski and Manchin have a bill that would authorize the Federal Energy Management Program and reinstate 10 years of forward-looking targets for energy intensity
Aren't
reductions.
there
That's with
economic incentives to accomplish this as well? That
Yes, these are
regardless of executive orders.
they're typically, these measures are cost effective and they're identified in these audits.
Right.
But the audits aren't necessary. You don't have to follow through with the audits. There's a bill that Senator Gardner's introduced that would require that. These are projects that may be, they're not the agency's focus. And so having these targets is one way to focus the agency's attention. They all fall in the category of things that ought to be done, but one thing you learn in energy efficiency is what ought to be done is not the same as what's being done. That's where some of these policies can really come in to help push the agencies, in this case, in the right direction.
Just as an aside, I spent a lot of my career trying to understand the economics of the manufacturing sector.
Mhm.
And if you look at the numbers, that sector has reduced their energy use quite drastically in the last 30 years, and it's purely economically driven. I mean, it's cost effective for them to do that. They know it. So they go ahead and do it because they're facing international competition.
That's right.
So, I mean, that's a success story, I think. There's more room to cut further, but, the pure economics of that actually worked for that sector.
Betsy mentioned some of the good work that DOE does on the R&D side. There are also programs like Better Buildings and Better Plants that are information sharing programs that highlight the success stories of these manufacturing gains, and they're impressive. And they even have an online video series where they take executives and facility managers from one sector and they switch places, sort of a trading places type of thing. And they did that with our Naval Academy and the Air Force Academy, where they traded facility managers it was great. It was a lot of fun.
There's a question, and I'll just pitch this to the group. Comment online. Someone asking about how important the Environmental Protection Agency's granting of small refinery exemptions under the RFS, the Renewable Fuel Standard. This is something apparently that Mayor Pete Buttigieg, Democratic candidate for president, brought up at the debate last night, and the asker is saying they were very critical of these exemptions. I think they're talking about refineries being exempted from the RFS. Is that, Tom or Dan, is that something that might be a bit outside of our bailiwick? Sorry, folks. RFS is a beast unto itself, and of course there are these political implications about, Iowa being the first voting state in America Tom, you look like the cat that ate the
No.
canary.
I at one point in time thought I understood that problem and that question, but I don't anymore. I haven't kept up,
It's
and the politics are extremely complicated.
They are extremely complicated, and there's an interesting sort of turf war between oil state senators and corn state senators, and that
Right.
goes across party lines. And I'm sorry that I am not an expert on that either, so I'm not gonna weigh in. Um, I want to talk about really what some sort of major energy deal might look like. Um, if we bring together all the topics we've hit on in this conversation and the various folks involved, folks like Senator Murkowski or White House from the climate side, there are key players in charge of key committees pushing bills like the Use It Act or maybe energy efficiency that are incredibly vocal on this issue of climate and energy broadly. I mean, is there a deal to be made, Betsy, or really anyone here? Is there, I don't know, is there some sort of clean energy deal or a job transition deal, some sort of legislation that could pass this session? Do you see? I don't know. Do you see a marriage between I don't know, Murkowski and Manchin happening, and some sort of bill coming from that partnership?
Both of the committees, Energy and Commerce Committee and the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, have had hearings and passed many bills dealing with energy efficiency, but also storage, research and development. There's an ARPA-E authorization bill that came out of the Science Committee. There's the weatherization authorization bill, and there are others that may be, that may touch the energy sector in other ways. I think for the most part, you could come up with a pretty long list of bills that are bipartisan, that probably would pass or have passed one or both chambers. I don't know whether there's a strategic advantage of trying to bundle them. That's been tried in the past, as 2012 and HR 8 was sort of the last example of that. Or if they pass individually, there was S535 that was passed, a small scale energy efficiency bill that President Obama signed into law. So I'm not going to second guess the chairmen and women of these committees in terms of how to do it, but I think there is, I'm optimistic about there being a window this Congress for some of the smaller scoped bipartisan bills passing.
This is a really good question coming in online. How are tariffs affecting energy companies and how are organizations responding? And let's expand that to energy industries. So how, I'll go to you, Tom, first, and then swing to you, Betsy, but how in this trade war between the U.S. and China, how has that spilled over and affected U.S. firms and industries?
Coal exports to China are down 64% this year, first half of this year. And in 2018, U.S. exports of LNG represented 7% of all Chinese imports of liquefied natural gas. 2019, it's down to 1%. So the retaliatory tariffs that the Chinese have put on are affecting both the coal industry and the LNG industry. And China is, of course, the big enchilada in terms of energy use, as we talked about earlier. So it's having a real impact.
Is there a dollar amount you can attach to those tariffs? That 7% to zero? I mean, we're talking tens of millions. What's the ballpark?
It would be better to look at it in terms of the potential growth. I mean, we have increased our exports of LNG by, 300% in the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. China is now the second second biggest importer of LNG in the world. So it may be foregone growth that is the better indicator of that. I don't have a dollar number. Just tip of my tongue.
No, understandably, these are complicated things. Betsy, how are you feeling? How is the coal industry feeling, and all the industries that connect to coal? How are they feeling the effects of the trade war?
Well, Tom said it. China is the big enchilada. It's a huge marketplace, and it's important. So a trade deal would be good.
Yeah.
No question about that. Our coal producers export thermal coal for power generation purposes and metallurgical coal for steel making to China and many other countries around the world. All of those tons are important. So, there are certainly impacts from the trade policies and what's going on there. There are other impacts that are more markets related. So it's kind of hard to parse it all out. It's
But
complicated.
in general, a deal would be, you'd like a deal. Yeah. Are
would
we
be good.
talking US, we're talking both tariffs and then how would a USMCA deal affect coal or energy industries broadly?
I don't have any specific comments on that. I mean, I think again, it's to the point where getting it solidified would be good, just in
Sure.
terms of the more certainty folks have, businesses have, the better off they are.
The United States is a big exporter of gas to Mexico. I don't think there's a major change coming with the new North American agreement. North America is energy independent, if you will. The three nations.
Yeah.
Canada, of course, hopes that USMCA will help ease their ability to complete pipelines so that they can export oil from Alberta, but I'm not sure that that's going to be helped that much by completion of the agreement.
What is holding that back? Is that
Well, it's
low oil price that's holding back projects like, I mean, Keystone
Well,
obviously is
yeah,
held
I
up
mean,
in
that's
legal fights, but is there a price threshold that makes a pipeline far more
the
appealing?
shale revolution in the United States has contributed mightily to moderating oil prices, and Alberta is a more of a high-cost producer, so indirectly they've been hurt by our ability to produce oil and gas from shale in the lower 48.
So someone wrote in, how do you recommend organizations prepare for 2020? I'm not sure what that means. If you want to rephrase your question and submit it again, I'll take a look at it, but I'm sorry, I'm not sure what that means. I want to talk about some sort of price on carbon and how you think a deal like that might get done. Of course, about 10 years ago, Waxman-Markey was this very famous and very contentious and very intense politically fight on the Hill, named after, of course, Henry Waxman, former congressman from California, and Ed Markey, senator now of Massachusetts. A lot of folks, a lot of economists, and certainly a handful, not many in the Republican Party, but certainly a handful of folks on the Hill view a carbon tax of some sort, whether a tax or a cap and trade market, as inevitable. They say this is the logical, economically clear-minded way to address climate change. So what do you think it takes, Tom, for us in Congress to get there?
Well, in the long run, I wouldn't underestimate the amount of support in certain Republican circles for a carbon tax because it's viewed as the most efficient way to accomplish the goal. I think in order to get there, you have to somehow work out the economics of this. I mean, a carbon tax would, of course, increase the price of energy, oil, gasoline, oil or gas to heat your homes. That affects people who can least afford it the most. So there have been a number of proposals out there, one of them endorsed by this group of wise men from California, George Shultz, and I don't know who else, Jim Baker, I think, signed on to this saying,
Yeah.
let's do a carbon tax, but then let's recycle it somehow into rebates for those who are affected most by that. I think, that has a macroeconomic effect as well that has to be thought about, but it's in that direction, it seems to me, that if we're ever going to have a carbon tax, you're going to have an element like that of sort of making sure that the economic impact on the lower couple of quintiles of the earners is mitigated.
You blunt that impact on the public.
Right.
And obviously it would be regressive to a certain extent, and maybe heavily regressive if the price were high.
Yeah, I think he's right. First, Tom, you're right, 100%. We have to make sure that we're not, increasing the energy burden of those who have least means to afford it. But we also have to, again, recognize that, this would have an impact on on the fossil fuel sector, and that could accelerate the impacts on these communities. And we should be thinking about what that looks like and be prepared for that, so that we're ready for it, and we're, this idea of transition, that's teed up. And then also, I think it's important to, while I understand that there's an appeal that this would be sort of economy-wide, but I think there's still also a need for sort of sector-specific strategies to address energy consumption in the building sector, the transportation sector, grid modernization, the utility sector. I think there's a way for those things to go hand in hand so that they're complementary.
Sort of a carrot and stick approach.
A carrot and stick approach, but also, just because you have this price on carbon doesn't mean that all these other barriers may go away. I'm not sure that everything could be solved just by that. There are other hurdles or barriers or disincentives to act, and I think some targeted sector-specific technologies would be a good thing to go along with that, and maybe that's one way a deal comes together as well.
It is often described as a panacea for climate change, and that's probably not the case. I'm just thinking of certain markets where heating oil, for example, is used to heat homes, which is very rare in America, but it exists in the Northeast.
For sure.
I spend too much time following Senator Murkowski around. It exists certainly in Alaska. Carbon tax would undeniably raise heating costs significantly in Alaska. Betsy, what do you think on this matter? Is a carbon tax inevitable, or some price rather, and what would you like to see out of such a bill?
I don't think it's inevitable.
Okay. Why not?
I don't see an appetite for it. You can take Washington State, look at that as an example.
You're talking last electoral cycle, Jay Inslee the governor of Washington, pushed pretty hard for a state carbon tax, and
it didn't pass. And it was the third time they tried it. I think twice with the legislature and once with consumers, or vice versa. But there were three tries. So I don't see the link between that and a carbon tax being inevitable. I think that if you look around, there aren't examples of where such a thing is truly successful. Australia put a carbon tax in, and 2 years later repealed it because the price of electricity went up, and it affected the economy. So there are all these ripple effects, and Dan talked about some of that kind of thing. It's people care about what they pay for energy. Think yellow jacket protests in France. So this is not a small thing, and so it would be more palatable, I think, to more people if they saw a pathway that had common sense and reason behind it. Just thinking of the confirmation hearing at the Senate for Deputy Secretary Brouillet at DOE, our next energy secretary, and there was so much support there for him. And if you listen to what he said, it was reasonable. It made sense. So I think, thinking in extremes of it's inevitable or it's this or it's that sort of sends people to their corners. It doesn't advance the dialogue.
You wouldn't be, just to play devil's advocate here, what Tom was alluding to earlier, sort of blunting the impact a price on carbon might have on the least fortunate among us. There is an idea that you would rebate the money that's sent to the federal treasury back to the public in monthly checks. How does that strike you? That doesn't
strikes me as unrealistic.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Wouldn't be very easy to implement,
Would not.
amongst
Do you
other
think
things.
people think that's really going to happen?
Some people do, certainly.
Okay.
No, it's percolating out there. I think we're close to wrapping up, but I want to just encourage you to keep sending in any last minute questions if you have them. I want to circle back just quickly to some sort of a breakthrough, and actually I want to turn the lens on me as a reporter. I'm curious. I'm sure you've all been, to a certain extent, paying attention to the folks campaigning for the presidency, and climate questions, energy questions, and environmental questions don't come up a lot. Some candidates on the Democratic side do bring up these issues, but often the press isn't asking them. So I want to ask the three of you, really, what role does the press here have in broaching energy issues? What would you like to see done better? How do we educate as reporters, as experts like yourselves? How do we educate the public more broadly? Because all of us in this room know that the conversation in Washington is very different from what's happening across the country on energy and environmental issues. So, what could I, as sort of representative of the fourth estate, be doing better? What stories aren't being told? How about that?
Okay,
Go first.
I'll be an outlier
Go for it.
first. We all think about and would like to get to a point where we didn't have to worry about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And one way to get there is by producing energy with either renewable resources or non-CO2 resources. I have worked on nuclear energy for 40 or 45 years, and the argument seems to have been lost. But there are new technologies. China and India are slowly building nuclear plants. Isn't there room for some compromise in the United States on trying to facilitate the use of that known technology? And maybe we need some more research, but people like Bill Gates are looking intensively into it to try to lower the price of nuclear energy. Shouldn't that be a proper subject for debate?
And nuclear plants they're not being built. When was the last one, if you know? I mean, it's been decades, right?
70s. Well, no, there's one in Georgia, a new one in Georgia, which has been, unfortunately, a disaster for...
The Vogtle plant?
Yeah, for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
But Gates is no dope, and he's putting a lot of his own money into, modular plants, and we can't even get one sited to test it out.
Mm-hmm.
I think Paul Allen has anyway.
That's
what I would like to see.
Mr. Gates, you heard it here. You are no dope. Please come on the podcast. We'd love to have you.
Didn't he just become
Ben
the
wants
wealthiest
to talk
person
to
again?
you.
Didn't he just overtake? Yeah.
I think he did.
You
Yeah.
know, to follow on what Tom said and your question, Ben, I think reporting more broadly would be helpful about what's going on in the rest of the world compared to the U.S.
So tying together.
Yes, because it
international-
matters. And if you want, if you want to talk about carbon, you want to talk about CO2 reduction, then you have to think beyond the U.S. And Asia right now has over 300 gigawatts of coal power coming on. That's bigger than our entire coal fleet. I mean, that's just what they have under construction. Their average age over there of a coal plant is 12 or 15 years.
Mhm.
Those plants are going to run for decades. We need to understand the context.
And we didn't even talk about the finance side of all of this, about how banks are planning for or maybe not planning for climate impacts, where they're lending their money, where they're not lending their money. So, but that's a point well taken. You do have to knit all of this together in a broader international fabric.
And I'll sort of borrow Betsy's approach, but look inward. There's a lot happening in states and in communities, just in the issue of resilience, for instance. There are states, there are places along the coast and along rivers that are experiencing, flooding events, sea level rise that, they haven't had to deal with before, and they're reacting to that, and they're doing really positive things. And I think if I could suggest something, it's to tell those stories. They may seem one-off, they may seem like case studies, but in fact, they're indicative of a larger trend. And people have different approaches, right? That's how we get to good solutions, is by trying different things and pushing different buttons. And it may seem like, well, who cares what's happening? Well, actually, the people who sit here in Congress, right? These are their constituents.
Right.
They actually do care quite a lot. And in my experience, they know generally speaking what's happening in their states. But I think they're encouraged by hearing the good stories of what's happening in where they're from. And that could even be part of an incentive to act.
Could you give us an example? Just, I'm thinking of Louisiana as where.
Well, Louisiana, we had a briefing a couple weeks ago, and we brought in 4 Louisianans to talk about community-based resilience, and they talked about how they, leveraged the faith community, all the different faith communities in southern Louisiana. They talked about how they, there was a great comment about in the past where they've talked about these issues, they had opportunities to comment. And in this approach, it's called LA Safe, they had an opportunity to participate, they had an opportunity to shape the direction. And, we had conversations with members of the Louisiana delegation on both sides, and they, I think first of all, they know exactly what's happening in Louisiana. But I think it's helpful for these kinds of stories to be told. These are positive stories, even though the people we're talking about are dealing with things that are very difficult to deal with, right? Losing ground to rising oceans is an unpleasant topic when that's where you're from.
Right.
But they're approaching it in a really mature and creative way, and I think those stories deserve to be told.
Right. We are going to leave it there, but I think that's a wonderful note to end on. And I would just say, to tack on as a final little addendum, I've covered climate change and energy and environmental issues for about 5 years now. And when I began, the conversation was very much about mitigation. It was about blunting the effects of climate change and knocking down CO2 levels. And now I don't know if it's a majority about adaptation, but the conversation has certainly swung in the direction, to your point, Dan, of how we adapt to and brace against the coming and already here impact. So I want to thank all of you. I want to thank the folks online for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.